A very warm welcome, everybody, to Hearers of the Word for the 13th Sunday in Year B. Our Gospel is Mark 5:21-43, the double story of the woman with the hemorrhage and the raising of Jairus' daughter. I hope you'll find the combining of the two stories intriguing. We'll go straight to the slides. A very warm welcome to everybody to Hearers of the Word. Our Gospel is Mark 5:21-43. For this fascinating Gospel, we will take the following steps. Number 1, the shock factor. Number 2, the Gospel itself. And then a general account of miracle stories, the place of this miracle story within Mark's first chain of stories, the technique of writing in sandwich ABA asterisk, the crises Mark was facing, and then finally we come to the inner story, the outer story, comparisons, message for today, and we close with a prayer. There are several shock factors in today's Gospel, and we may miss these unless we pay close attention. The first concerns purity rules. Given the strict rules regarding ritual purity, it was unprecedented that a woman with some kind of gynecological complaint should actually touch a man. The man would contract ritual impurity from the woman. Conversely, Jesus touched a corpse, which was also strictly forbidden and would entail ritual impurity. So in this case, both the woman and Jesus act courageously and against the established tradition, actually in this case for the sake of something much greater. The second shock factor contains a contrast between the two main figures, Jairus and the nameless woman. Jairus is the leader of the synagogue, and he is named, he is male, wealthy, the leader of a synagogue, a parent concerned about his sick daughter, who approaches Jesus publicly to ask for healing for his daughter, but receives a far greater miracle privately and is commanded not to tell anyone. The woman, by contrast, is nameless, poor, and because of her condition, excluded from the synagogue. The woman has no children and can have none, and she is concerned about the living death she bears in her own body. And she approaches Jesus surreptitiously, receives the miracle in the most intimate secrecy, but is compelled by Jesus to make it public. So two very contrasting presentations. The pairing of the two stories also has a very positive effect. For example, both have faith, both overcome ritual impurity, both react with fear and amazement. Both experience the saving power of Jesus, and the male-female barrier is also overcome. And both cases reflect the newness of the Christian community generated by the Christ event. And the reader may remember a passage from Galatians 3:28. There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ. Although the Gospel is quite long, I thought it would be an advantage to have the whole text on one page, even though the print is fairly small. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, they saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was about 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. A brief note on miracle stories won't be out of place here. Generally, miracle stories follow a familiar pattern. The condition is described. There is an encounter with the healer. The healing takes place by words and/or a gesture of some sort. The cure is usually immediate. The cure is then confirmed by some action, and then we hear the reactions of those present. In this case here, the story of Jairus' daughter, the story is in the usual order with considerable delaying techniques, chiefly with the story of the woman with the hemorrhage and also the neighbours coming to say the daughter is already dead. By contrast, the story of the woman with the hemorrhage is in an unusual order, inverted, with the cure preceding the encounter and the implied request. It can be of considerable help to locate a particular story within Mark's overall narrative, and it's commonly recognized that Mark has two chains of stories probably received from the oral tradition, which resemble each other. Chain 1, Catena 1, has the stilling of the storm, the Gerasene demoniac, the woman with the hemorrhage, Jairus' daughter, and the feeding of the 5,000. And chain 2 has Jesus walks on the sea, the blind man of Bethsaida, the Syrophoenician woman, the deaf mute, and the feeding of the 4,000. Our story comes from the first chain or catena. Within the first chain or catena, it's commonly thought that the three miracle stories lead to a sort of climax. The stilling of the storm indicates authority over nature and chaos. The slightly comical story of the Gerasene demoniac is authority over the forces of evil represented by the demons. And our double story indicates authority over sickness and even over life or life and death. And the question Mark has in mind throughout is, who then is this? The focus is always on the person of Jesus. It is very apparent in Mark 5:21-43 that Mark is using what's called a sandwich technique. So we begin with the story of Jairus' daughter in verses 21 to 24, and that story concludes in verses 35 to 43. And in between we have the story of the woman with the hemorrhage. And the name given to this pattern, ABA asterisk, is often a sandwich technique quite frequently used in Mark's Gospel. The Gospel writer is not responsible for discovering this ABA asterisk technique. It already occurs in the Old Testament and in Greek and Roman literature. However, Mark does use this format more frequently than either Matthew or Luke. And there are 6 generally acknowledged examples: 3, 22 to 30, 5, 21 to 43 our story, 6, 6b to 29, 11, 25, 12 to 25, 14, 1 to 11, and 14, 53 to 72. There are other possible examples identified but not always agreed: 1, 4 to 8, 1, 21 to 28, 4, 3 to 22, 6, 7 to 30, 13, 5 to 27, and 14, 18 to 25. So as you can see, quite frequent, so very much part of Mark's teaching technique, and the layout is an important clue for understanding what Mark is trying to get across. It may help to recall again the interesting times in which Mark wrote his Gospel. The Jewish war was reaching its climax with the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in the year 70, the deaths of the great founders such as the 2 Jameses, Peter and Paul. Nero, a very eccentric emperor, had committed suicide in the year 70. Then followed a year of great political chaos, called by historians the Year of the 4 Emperors. One emerged triumphant, Vespasian. This change of emperor marked the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the start of the very brief Flavian dynasty. Although Mark's community was made up of Jews and Gentiles, there must have been pressure to come out as Jewish in support of the national cause. So we may say in summary, death was in the air. It was a time of tremendous struggle and very hard choices. With all these preparatory thoughts in mind, we can turn at last to the text itself. And they're going to begin with the inner story, the story of the woman with the hemorrhage. So it starts in 524b. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. And she had heard about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. It's important detail at the beginning, the crowd pressing in, that makes it absurd to ask, who touched me? The condition is given in detail. It had, of course, it was medical, but also ritual and social. The woman was excluded. Unlike normal miracle stories, there is no request and no encounter between the patient and the healer. The cure is immediate and registered by the patient herself. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Of course, Jesus' question, "Who touched me?" does seem strange. But finally we come to the encounter between the patient and the healer, this time in the form of a search. And at last we have the delayed request. She told him the whole truth. And Jesus' reply is very comprehensive. He addresses her as daughter. He says, "Your faith has made you well." And the word for made you well is saved you. It's the same word in Greek. Go in peace. That means enjoy the well-being of shalom and be healed of your disease. So a very comprehensive affirmation of what had happened to her. So we now turn to the outer story of our pair of narratives. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. Jairus is the translation of a perfectly good Jewish name, Yair. Notice that he fell at his feet and begged. The woman will also fall at his feet. The condition is described fairly opaquely in less detail, but she's at the point of death, and the request is very clearly verbalized, and Jesus' agreement is implied, so he went with him. While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. In some ways, this is a further delaying technique, following on the delaying technique of the story of the woman with the hemorrhage. But it's more than that. Suspense is raised. He can help the sick, but can he help those who have died? The important words, "do not fear, only believe," stand at the centre of this little paragraph. The commotion and wailing is also a delay in suspense, but a mark that mourning had already begun. And the fact that the response is so negative, they laughed at him, leads to a very direct response from Jesus himself. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, but told them to give her something to eat. So at this point in the story, Jesus is very much in charge, having expelled all those who laughed at him, and then taking a limited group in to see the child. The cure itself, of course, is an echo of Elijah's cures, but without the paraphernalia and elaborate gestures. Here it's much simpler. He took her by the hand and said. The child's age is important because it makes an internal link with the woman with the hemorrhage, who suffered for 12 years. The messianic secret is part of Mark's agenda here and, of course, is impractical. The food is very practical, but indicates also the effectiveness of the cure. As we come to a close, some further comparisons may help. For example, Jairus falls down in front of Jesus, and so does the woman. It is notable that both narratives have women as central characters, and both underline the need for faith. Apart from the heightening effect of the inserted story, the number 12 links the two tales. The woman suffered for 12 years, and the little girl was 12 years old. Both are also called daughter, and touch is involved in both stories. And both are freed to become bearers of life at a symbolic level. The woman can now have children, and the girl is at the age appropriate for marriage in the culture. So they're restored to life and to society and to well-being. In his excellent commentary on Mark's Gospel, Eugene Boring has the following insights to offer. The story points beyond itself to the Christ event as a whole, to Jesus' own resurrection. Readers are not asked whether they believe that once upon a time Jesus raised a little girl from the dead, but are challenged to believe that once for all time God raised Jesus from the dead. This too is indicated by the concluding Markan overlay of the Messianic secret, extremely difficult to imagine historically, but making sense in terms of Mark's Christology. The ministry of Jesus was indeed an epiphany of God's power, but this must remain secret for the present, for it could only be perceived after and in terms of his own death and resurrection. These are very helpful comments from Eugene Boring, reminding us that the miracle stories in fact often point beyond themselves to the gospel or to the resurrection. And we come to a close with a prayer. God of the living, in whose image we have been formed with imperishable life as our destiny, dispel from your people the fear of death and awaken within us the faith that saves. Bid us rise from the death of sin to take our place in the new creation. This prayer we make through your Son, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God, for ever and ever. Amen. Thank you very much for joining in this short reflection on the double story in Mark's Gospel, and I hope you found the various pointers and insights helpful for your own exploration of this wonderful Gospel passage. Every blessing. God bless.